Hi, Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I want to discuss the topic of why it is that Tolkien and his worlds are so compelling. A lot of people recognize this, that Tolkien is one of the best world creators in fiction, and I want to explore why that is. Why is that Tolkien uniquely, almost among, fantasy and science fiction authors, is the person who can create a world that is so engrossing that you just almost forget that you're completely in a different world. Part of that you could put down to the fact that he's not really creating a different world, he's creating a prehistoric version of our world, but I don't think that really answers the question. So let's take a look at why I think it really does work as well as it does. So for starters, Tolkien is legitimately just a creative person. If you look at aspects of his life outside of his fiction, you can see other ways in which he was a very creative person. He did a lot of illustrations, either illustrating his own fiction or just drawing things in general. And you can tell that while, he's not Leonardo da Vinci, he definitely has a talent for doing, art in a physical sense, not just in a literary sense. And so you can definitely tell that Tolkien is creative. He's just got a really good creative streak going for him. And in that sense, he's off to a good start just on his own. But obviously, he's not unique in that way. Another aspect of Tolkien's creativity in general is you can tell from reading his biography that he is in a lot of ways a very emotional person. And by emotional, I mean like he has depressive periods. He had, periods where his emotions were very high. He's not he's not a necessarily a typical individual in regards to that. And if you know a lot about other types of artists, for example, musicians, a lot of some of their best music comes out of depressive periods or, things like that, where it seems like, really high or low swings of emotion lead to very creative output for whatever reason. It's not really clear why that is, but there seems to be a very high correlation there. And Tolkien had his depressive periods. He had, his elative periods, when he first met Edith and began falling in love with her. He was, basically on cloud nine. I mean, reading some of the descriptions and things of what he wrote, it's like you can tell the guy was very, very, emotionally on a high note there. So there's a lot of that goes into it, and it's really interesting to see how that plays in. But his emotions and his creativity aren't the only thing that play into this. Another aspect, of course, of Tolkien that's, very profound in his own life is his own sense of perfectionism and just the degree to which he will go to detail to make sure that everything is right. I mean, if you read his biography or know much of anything about the history of his writing of the Lord of the Rings, he wrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it, and he was doing the same thing with the Silmarillion over the course of his life. I mean, he started writing some of the Silmarillion stories in the 19 teens and was constantly coming back to them, either changing small details or adding small details, retconning things based on things that he added in the Lord of the Rings that he then had to go back and put into the Silmarillion. Just tons of different stuff like that. And it's not even just, you know, adding for the sake of being better. It's also just he's constantly looking for how to best word a sentence to make it sound better. I mean, if you even look at some of the poetry he wrote, he will go back and redo lines, sometimes very or meticulously, just to make sure that the meter works just a smidge better or the rhyme scheme works just a little better or something like that. I mean, you can see over the course of his life lots of different ways in which his perfectionism plays a huge role as well. But even here, there's a lot of people who are both creative and kind of perfectionists. So I still don't think this is the full explanation of why Tolkien really, kind of wins the medal for best creator of a consistent world. So why does he? Where I really think Tolkien is unique, though, is in the combination of his not only his emotional his creativity and whatnot, but also the perfectionism and the orderliness of his mind in general. He's not just a perfectionist. His entire career as an academic is based around language. And of course, language is the fundamental basis for the Silmarillion stories. He starts with the language, and then he has to come up with a history to explain, the differences in the languages and all this other stuff. And it's interesting to see how that plays out historically if you read, some of how he writes his material. But what I want to focus on here is the fact that he wrote not only because of the languages, but the language aspect of it itself is indicative of a very scientific side of his mind. Because we're talking about a guy who is not just another scholar. I mean, it would be one thing if he was just a guy who happened to be a professor of Anglo-Saxon. He wasn't that. He was way more than that. He was one of the foremost, and still to this day, some of the insights that he gained during his academic career are among some of the best discoveries in his field. So we're talking about a guy who is not just a student of language or a professor of language, but one of the best philologists that's ever been. And that indicates something beyond, just the perfectionism and the creativity. In fact, if you read his biography and by the way, when I reference his biography, I'm referring to the Humphrey Carpenter biography. If you read his biography, you get a sense of just how important his contributions were, because there's a point where I don't remember exactly how he says it, but he says something to the effect that a lot of his colleagues were kind of disappointed that he spent so much time on his fiction, because they had expected way more of him in terms of his academic career, the things that he would, be anticipated to contribute to the study of Anglo-Saxon and philology in general. And after he finally published The Lord of the Rings, he finally gets down to doing some of that stuff, but he never quite does as much as what everybody would have hoped he would have done. Part of that, of course, is because he's a perfectionist, and one of the aspects of that that's kind of funny in the biography, he taught way more classes than the average professor because he thought that it was necessary for the students to really get, the full experience of it. And because he taught so many classes, he had less time to do research and things like that. But there's actually an entire book out there by Tolkien, but not published by him, The Homecoming of Bjorknoth. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. I really don't know how to pronounce it. But that book is basically about an explanation of a particular old text where he is coming up with theories and things of basically related to the language. And the guy who actually edited and published it is himself a major person working in that language field. And in the intro, he says, I had a lot of these theories, and then when I was given this, text that was written by Tolkien, I realized he had already come to a lot of the same conclusions. There are ways in which he kind of adds and builds on Tolkien and corrects a few things based on later research, but that tells you, Tolkien was kind of ahead of his time. He was a total genius when it came to this, and that's, you can't put that down to his creativity, although you might put some of it down. Hypothesizing new ideas is a sort of creative process, but it's a very scientific type of creativity. And so I think that is why his world is so compelling, because the combination of the scientific aspect of his mind and the more purely creative aspect of his mind, plus all of his perfectionism, combine to give basically almost a perfect setup for inspiration. And when I say inspiration, I really do mean that. So let me explore some of Tolkien's own thoughts and some other connected ideas, talking about how his work was very much an inspired process. So fairly late in the process of writing The Lord of the Rings, when Tolkien comes to the part where Frodo and Sam meets Faramir, during this whole process, he's writing letters back and forth to his son Christopher, who at the time was in the Air Force in World War II, and he often will send portions of what he's writing for Christopher to critique. And he comes to this point, and he basically tells Christopher, I didn't want Faramir. and yet out he came striding out of the woods of Ithilien, and there he is. And the way he describes it, he's describing basically this idea of being inspired to write the character of Faramir. Of course, he knew Boromir from way back, but he didn't know Boromir had a brother until, bam, he just kind of appears out of nowhere in the story. And you get this idea a lot the more you read either by Tolkien directly or in his biography, that sort of thing. You'll find a lot of instances where there will be remarks that indicate that Tolkien feels more like he's discovering the story than creating it. And I mean, he actually uses that term. Similarly, when he writes Leaf by Niggle, which is, despite his, dislike of allegory, a very allegorical story about himself, essentially. He also describes Niggle's process of painting in a very similar way. It's like he'll start with a leaf and then gradually kind of the tree fills itself out, not because he's planting the tree, but because it just comes to him. And so Tolkien himself sees his own process as being one of kind of inspiration, in the sense of he's not inventing, it's just coming to him. And I think a lot of that has to do with the creativity and the scientificness of his mind, because another thing you'll find, uh, a lot of the times with what he'll do with other aspects of his story that either ended up in secondary materials like the unfinished tales or things like that, or just in, if you read some of his letters where he answers readers' questions, he'll often be asked a question about something that isn't directly addressed in the published work, The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and whatnot. And he'll kind of work out, not so much by just making up something on the spot to answer the question, but kind of by logical deduction from what he already knows about his own stories. He'll basically explain, well, this is what must be the case. And it's not a process, like I said, of making it up. He literally is either kind of just doing it by logical processes where he's taking his own story and saying, well, if I look at this and I look at this, what must have been the answer to this question? I mean, he's not inventing. He's still just kind of pulling things from the world he's already created and understanding on his own, as if it was a real world from which we could draw conclusions, what must have been the case about whatever question was asked. And the same kind of thing happens with the unfinished tales materials and things like that. He adds Galadriel into the Lord of the Rings story, who was never a part of the Silmarillion story, but then he has to go back and rewrite the Silmarillion and add her in. And he goes through several stages of adding different versions of Galadriel into the Silmarillion stories until, it's not really clear where his mind ended up, but you could tell he's kind of trying to figure out, there's this really powerful elf woman who is, here, and who clearly must have come from the West, because we know that from what she says in the story. So how could she have been this really powerful person, and we've never really met her before? And so he has to figure out a way to incorporate her logically into the Silmarillion. Another interesting piece of evidence of this is his description of writing the scene on the field of Cormallen. This doesn't make it into the movies, so if you haven't read the books, you don't know what I'm talking about. But after Frodo and Sam destroy the ring, they are taken to the victorious army of Gondor, and they make camp in this field called Cormallen. And this is not in Minas Tirith, but this is where, they are basically kind of presented to the people as the heroes they are. And Tolkien, in a letter, describes his writing of this and says that while he was writing it, he, openly wept while he was doing it. Now, there's two possible explanations for that. One is he's so emotionally connected to his characters that even though he's inventing it wholesale, he just finds the whole thing, just overpoweringly emotional. That's possible, but, I find it hard to believe that even a very emotional person could, just invent something on his own and, end up with that. So the theory that I think works a little better is he's, when he's writing this scene, he is playing out what, again, he's kind of discovering it and playing out what would have happened, under these circumstances. And as the realization comes to him, the emotional power of it, is that much greater because he's not just consciously thinking about, how should I write this scene, so much as he's kind of receiving it in the sense of this is, the logical way this would go. And so I think, again, there you've got the idea that he is not inventing so much as discovering. And on a final note on this line, there's another letter that he writes much later, where he says he meets this older fellow at one time, and they get into a discussion about his fiction or whatever, and the old guy says, "Of course, you don't suppose, do you, that you wrote all that book by yourself?" And Tolkien, of course, writing the letter, says, "Pure Gandalf," because uh, in at the end of The Hobbit, Gandalf says to Bilbo, "Of course, you don't suppose, do you, that all of these things happen to you for your sole benefit just because you're lucky?" I mean, and there, of course, Gandalf is pointing out the actions of Providence in Bilbo's own adventure. And so Tolkien is looking at this and getting this from this guy and says, "No, I don't suppose that I wrote it all by myself." Uh, so it's an interesting little story where he's basically acknowledging that other people can even see that there's more to the story than what any one mind could just creatively invent on its own. There's more to it than that. Whether you take that as inspiration in a more religious sense or spiritual sense, or if you just take it as, the way I'm kind of describing, the inspiration comes from his creativity, but also the orderly scientific aspect of his mind is combining. Either way, I mean, inspiration is a hard thing to explain. We don't really know exactly how that works. It's a very unique process. And so, no matter how you take it, I think the point is still the same. Tolkien didn't create Middle Earth. It was, there was aspects of it that he invented, of course, but the overall shape and structure he might have created, but a lot of the details, they kind of filled themselves out on their own in a sense. And so I think that ultimately is why his worlds are so compelling, because the marriage of his emotional creative side and his scientific orderly mind, those two things combined, I think really created, in a lot of ways, in the sense of, they just kind of logically filled out all the different things after Tolkien started the basic process. They filled out all the rest of it, and that's why everything there, combined with his perfectionism, of course, because he goes back and like changes the story to make sure that the phases of the moon are right in different passages. Combine all those things, there's basically almost no mistakes. There's nothing you can poke holes in. Everything works. And you can't say that about everybody. And I think ultimately that's why Tolkien's worlds are so compelling. So, hope you enjoyed that video. Hope you thought it was an interesting approach to looking at how Tolkien writes things. I do encourage anyone who's interested in this to go and read his letters and the biography, because they really give you a better sense of how he goes about his writing process and things like that. So, and there's other books out there too on the same topic that I haven't even read yet. So, there's a lot of good material out there for this sort of thing. But if you did enjoy the video, please do give it a thumbs up. Please do share it around. If you want to follow me on Twitter, you can do that at JRRTLore, where I will occasionally drop some trivia questions related to Tolkien. You can, of course, subscribe to the channel here. Don't forget to click that bell icon. You can support the channel here, and you can find my previous videos here. Until next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie.